So, the the program tonight is to discuss, we're continuing to discuss the alternative movements or different movements in Judaism. And I want to welcome Christina, who is the newest Jew on the screen of about 3 or 4 days. Mazal Tov and Yasher
Welcome
Koach.
to the tribe.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, so what I thought we would do is actually go in order of their formal appearance in the world of Judaism. Actually, more or less for the last 2 weeks, we discussed Reform Judaism, which is the oldest movement in Judaism, because people think Orthodoxy has been around since Moses, but as we'll see, as a formal movement with organization, it really is much later. So first comes the Reform movement, which begins in the 1820s. We discussed that last time and the time before. And then the next one actually is Conservative Judaism. And I think with a little bit of effort, we can get through both Conservative and Orthodoxy tonight. And then I don't know what we'll do next. Okay, so I presume we can see the screen. And so would someone like to read about Conservative Judaism?
Sure.
Thank you,
The
Jerry.
conservative movement is one of three largest religious denominations within American Judaism. Historically, it has occupied a sort of middle ground between Reform and Orthodox, maintaining, unlike Reform, that Jewish law remains binding on modern Jews, but affording far greater leeway than Orthodoxy in adapting those laws to reflect modern realities. The movement tolerates a range of religious practice in its commitment to halakha pluralism. The idea that multiple and opposing opinions concerning the requirements of Jewish law can be considered equally legitimate.
Yeah, let me comment. So I would say what distinguishes Reform Judaism is this sense that halacha is not binding. And there's no kind of official definition of Reform Judaism. Most of you have heard my own definition, which is that the laws that are related to ethical issues, how we treat one another, I would say animals and the environment, Jewish law is binding on individual Jews. And the ritual laws, which would be things like, do you wear a yarmulke? Do you keep strictly kosher? Do you pray 3 times a day and so on, are really between you and God. The conservative movement says Jewish law is binding on all Jews, but my simple way of looking at it, we're going to get more detail in this article, is that Jewish law changes with the times. And we'll see examples discussed in the article. And in this way, I think what they are really consciously doing is the process of the Talmud, where clearly in the Talmud, Jewish law is being adapted to change with the times, but the rabbis of the Talmud are relying on almost a mythical approach, which says all of those oral laws and even the rules for how you analyze oral law to write it down and make the Talmud were given to Moses on Sinai. So really, we rabbis don't have the ability to change the law. It's just we're adapting the law the way God intended us to adopt the law. I think the conservative movement does that and not being so self-conscious. But the interesting thing there is there's a Jewish law committee in the conservative movement that's headed by a friend of mine named Elliot Dorff. And in that committee, there will be several opinions, and they don't necessarily come to one conclusion. Alan.
In this collection which we're discussing is halakha. I wanted to make sure the halakha is a combination of real laws, and others are customs.
So yeah, so what I would say is halacha refers to Jewish law.
Right.
Customs are often called minchag.
Yeah.
So
Minchag.
there will be a law, and then different communities will have their own customs, which for that community may rise to a seemingly level of law, but it may not be decided as firm halacha.
Would a law be men have to wear a head covering in worship? Is that a law?
It's a law for which in Orthodoxy, I don't know of any Orthodox community or even conservative community that would say inside a synagogue it's okay for men not to have their heads covered. There's no clear reason for it, and I studied this when I wrote my book, and I remember a bit of Talmud, or maybe it's medieval commentary, fairly late. When I say late, I'm guessing like 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century, Common Era, where a rabbi is saying, I can't find any reason why we have to do this, but everybody insists on doing it, my colleagues, the other rabbis, so who am I to argue? So that may be an example where minchag becomes halacha.
It relates to women practices, where I was going with this, right? So women are not covered covered is the right word, treated the same way as men, but in Reform, we've developed customs and practices for women's, right? Their customs.
Yeah, so I think women covering their hair was more, well,
it was actually about modesty, and that
about modesty. Thank you. That was the word. That was the word I was looking for. So again, in Reform Judaism, men and women are treated as much as possible the same. So it's very common for women in the Reform movement to obey many ritual laws, such as talit, such as wearing a kippah, such as even putting on tefillin. Bryce.
Yeah, what I'm about to observe is not illustrative of anything, and I'm not advocating anything. It's just interesting, and that is this observation is that Judaism, or I should say, Reform Judaism, says that so many of these 613 mitzvot are up to your own.
Between you and God.
Judgment.
Yes.
Between you and God. They are not, and that only a subset of those are required.
That's my interpretation.
Yeah, what's interesting to me, just interesting, is that Catholicism, Christianity, then said you don't need to do the rest. Since I realize that there's no time sequence for that. Yes. But it's interesting that if you look at it as a Venn diagram.
Yep. I absolutely share your observation, and it reminds me of Yitz Greenberg's comment, a liberal Orthodox rabbi, that says, "I don't care which movement in Judaism you're a part of, as long as you're ashamed of it." And a valid critique of Reform Judaism is that in some ways we have strayed away from what is the heart of Judaism, which is observance, and it's alarmingly close to Christianity. What I would also add, even the rabbis will say about half of the 613 don't apply because they relate to the temple worship service. Alan, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to add. Your hand is up. I guess not. Jerry.
Yeah, Bryce used the word requirement. I did never see that in any of my religious connections to whether it's Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox. Expectations may be a better word that,
How about the word commandment?
Well,
a mitzvah, which is a commandment, commanded by a mitzvah, which
But
is
we're
the commander.
expected to follow those commandments for
We are
sure.
commanded to follow those commandments. They're not
Yeah.
optional.
No, exactly. But I didn't say it was not. I'm just saying there is that kind of level of expectation. I recently I grew up in a fairly Orthodox
Mm-hmm.
home. My mother was and father, my family was glad kosher.
Mm-hmm.
And I recently, about 3 years ago, went back to keeping strictly kosher.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that I know that are not as observant as I am were surprised
Mm-hmm.
and said, "But you're reformed." And
Mm-hmm.
I went, "Yeah." What
Yeah,
does that
yes,
have to
yes.
do?
So there's no barrier in reform to
Right,
being as observant as you want to be. When I hear
exactly.
the word you're expected or expectation, it sounds a little less rigorous to my ear than commanded. But
Okay.
the word is
Yeah.
commandment. They're not 613 suggestions. They are 613 commandments.
But
Yeah.
Orthodox Jews do not recognize Reform Jews.
Oh,
They
I,
do
that's
not
not true.
at all.
so stop for a second. What I would say is knowledgeable Orthodox Jews would say that Reform Judaism is not a valid practice of Judaism. They would certainly agree that I am Jewish because my mother is Jewish. They might or might not agree to call me rabbi. It actually surprises me when Chabad rabbis will refer to me as rabbi. And I have noticed very carefully, and it's a mild sore point in our community when we have joint events with Chabad, and one of the female rabbis is called, and let's say a Chabad rabbi is kind of organizing it. I mean, we had one of these when after
Oh,
the murders in,
oh,
I think it wasn't, it was at the Chabad synagogue, and the woman rabbi was not introduced as rabbi. She
right.
was an important leader in our community, whereas the male rabbis were introduced as rabbis. So, but they would recognize Reform Judaism as Reform Jews as Jewish,
Yes.
but they would say Reform Judaism is not a valid expression of Judaism for reasons which I hope will be clear after we read these articles. So, Jerry, I'm going to lower your hand.
Okay.
I can do that for you. And why don't you continue with most, but not all?
Most, but not all, conservative synagogues are egalitarian on gender issues. And the movement has endorsed religious rulings, both in favor of and opposed to same sex marriage. While its rabbis are not permitted to officiate at interfaith weddings, the movement has in recent years made a greater effort to welcome interfaith couples and families into its congregation. One of its mottos has been tradition and change. In the mid 20th century, the conservative movement was the dominant stream of American Judaism. In some years, in the 1950s, the movement was adding 100 new affiliate congregations annually. But by the end of the century, the movement was in serious decline, with some fretting openly that conservative Judaism was on the road to oblivion.
So
That's
I'll just comment about the issue of interfaith weddings. There is an organization of the conservative rabbis called the Rabbinical Assembly.
right.
And if a conservative rabbi were to officiate at an interfaith wedding, he or she would lose her membership in the Rabbinical Assembly. This a few years ago, the prohibition even extended to a conservative rabbi attending an interfaith wedding, even though it might be the wedding of their own children. And that was actually relaxed some to say that he or she could attend the wedding, but not officiate. And it is not uncommon for me to have a conservative friend or colleague, um, send a couple to me, you know, a couple that's one of whom, the Jewish party of whom, has been a longstanding member of their congregation, and they're getting married. Their rabbi can't do the wedding, so he will send them to, you know, somebody he knows and trusts. Okay, so we can continue. Jerry, if you're comfortable reading, you can continue.
Conservative Judaism's beginnings. The movement began as an effort to conserve traditional Judaism in the face of liberalizing tendencies of reform leaders in the 19th century. One critical moment of division is often said to be the reform movement's famous 1883 Trefa banquet.
Trefa.
Oh my God. When non-kosher food was served at a dinner honoring the first rabbis ordained through the Reform Seminary. I could just see the shrimp being passed.
Yeah,
Oh,
so I
that's
think we
awful.
discussed this. It's very, very famous.
We did.
The first rabbinical class in 1883,
Oh,
at the dinner celebrating their ordination, they had it at the fanciest hotel in Cincinnati, and shrimp cocktail was served. I mean, it wasn't close. And it has never been, at least to my knowledge, clearly determined whether that was deliberate or whether they just said, serve us, you know, the nicest dinner you can think of, because clearly the hotel wasn't, I'm sure it was not a kosher caterer in Cincinnati at that
well,
time. Cincinnati was the
it's
Wild
not,
West.
yeah,
So,
it would
so
happen in Cleveland, but not Cincinnati.
So there is controversy about whether that was deliberate on the part of Isaac Mayer Wise, and my guess is it was not, because he was really trying to form, I think we discussed this last time, an American Judaism. And if you think about the names of the organizations that he created, the Rabbinic Association is the Central Conference of American Rabbis. The congregational organization was the UAH, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and the school was Hebrew Union College. So there was no mention of reform in any of those organizations. And everything I know about it is that he was trying to form a unique American Judaism, and that was destroyed when they first sat down to dinner.
Well, it didn't go over well. Destroyed is overstating it.
Well, the idea of having one joint form of Judaism, I think, was destroyed. Maybe I'm overstating it slightly. Okay. Why don't you pick up Jerry at the Jewish Theological Seminary
the
right here?
Jewish Theological Seminary of America, which would become the flagship institution of the conservative movement, was founded in 1886, 1 year after Reform adopted its Pittsburgh platform of 1885, which explicitly rejected Jewish practices it viewed as inconsistent with modern ideas.
So JTS still exists. It's the Conservative Movement Seminary in New York, and there's a second Conservative Movement seminary, called it used to be called University of Judaism. Now it's American Jewish University, and it's on the Sepulveda Pass. At the moment, they're trying to sell the building.
Really?
In Los Angeles, yes.
Are
And
they-
that actually reflects lower enrollment, lower interest, and probably some of the most expensive real estate and valuable real estate
for
around
sure.
that campus.
Sure.
So they are
Rabbi,
trying.
I think it also, this evaluation also includes the Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles near USC, is also up for evaluation as to maybe finding some property that is more effective for both movements.
Oh, yeah, there's been some discussion of that. I thought you were
Yeah.
going to say the thinking of closing it, which I'd be horrified.
Not closing and not merging, just using some real
just
estate
sharing space. That would be that would be a nice idea. And
nice.
yeah. Okay. So Jerry, let's continue. Some historians.
Yes, some historians have suggested that the real impulse in establishing the conservative movement was not to offer more traditional Jewish approach than that offered by Reform, but a more liberal and Americanized version of European style orthodoxy. Oh boy, is that confusing. The movement's most dramatic growth period was propelled by the mass immigration of largely Orthodox Jews in the late 19th century, right? 19th and 20th century, and their children and grandchildren who were drawn to practice of Judaism that preserved much of the flavor of European Orthodoxy, but in a way that was palatable to assimilating community. The single
Signal, actually, you were
contribution,
right the first time.
oh, the signal
I might even be able to make it
contribution
a little
of
larger.
conservatism, this socialist Marshall Sklar wrote.
Sociologist. Marshall may be a socialist, but let's.
Sociologist,
Yes.
sorry. Marshall Sklar wrote in his 1940 and slip, 1955, Conservative Judaism, an American religious movement, would seem to be that of offering an acceptable pattern of adjustment to the American environment for many Eastern European Jews.
And I remember studying this, and one of my teachers saying that, you know, on the bay near the Statue of Liberty, of all these ships coming into New York Harbor, are thousands and thousands of sets of tefillin, as the Orthodox Jews coming into this country realized they couldn't continue to be Orthodox and had to adjust their lifestyle. I mean, you know, people had to work on Saturdays and so on. So my understanding is one of the motivations for the conservative movement was the new immigrants and late 19th century, early 20th century couldn't handle the I'll just say the Goyish style, the non-Jewish style of the reform movement, particularly classical reform, with no tallis and no yarmulkes and so on. And so a new movement was created, which was sort of a compromise between orthodoxy and tradition.
Right.
Yeah, Alan. You're muted, Alan.
Sorry. The centerpiece of one of the influences of conservative movement was mixed seating that allowed men and women pray together.
Yes.
That's part of Reform Judaism that they liked, and many of the other things you allude to, they were not comfortable in that respect. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Jerry, you want to continue?
Sure. Like Reform, the conservative movement's roots were in Europe, but its flourishing would happen only in America. Among its earliest intellectual figures was the Prague-born Zachariah Frankel, who called for a positive historical approach that considered the evolution of Judaism within its appropriate historic context. Another was Solomon Schechter, who was born in what is now Romania. Oh, my grandmother's home country. And would go on to lead JTS, the conservative movement's network of Jewish day schools, is named for him.
Yeah, you may be familiar, particularly on the East Coast, of Solomon Schechter schools.
Yes. Well, putting it together. Thank you. Over the years, the movement provided a home to some of the most influential and innovative Jewish thinkers in the United States. Perhaps none would have more lasting legacy than Abraham Joshua Heschel, yes, who gained worldwide fame as a social activist who marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma in 1965. I remember that. Heschel was a professor at JTS for 27 years, spin off his own movement.
No, prior to his death in
Prior
1970.
to his death, sorry, in 1972. Another conservative thinker, Mordecai Kaplan, would eventually spin off his own movement, Reconstructionalist Judaism.
Yeah. So, just a comment about Heschel. Heschel's life was saved by the Reform movement. The Reform movement got the funds together to rescue a number of the great Jewish scholars in Europe and brought them over and got them through immigration by hiring them to teach at HUC. And Heschel was one of those, but of course he was way too traditional to really stay with HUC. So he became a leader, a great thinker of the conservative movement. The other thing to think about,
the Heschel school is more orthodox than conservative.
I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
there are schools named after different people.
My grandchildren went there.
Yeah. So I
they feed into Ramah.
It's a Solomon Schechter school, Heschel.
Okay, so it's in the conservative movement. Ramah is a conservative, is part of the conservative movement as well. And if you don't believe me, just ask Christina, because she is a nurse at Camp Ramah in the summers, right?
Oh, my grandchildren are going to be there.
Okay. The other thing I want to comment is Orthodoxy really doesn't struggle with Jewish law. The law is written and you follow it.
Yeah, done.
Reform Judaism doesn't struggle with Jewish law. The law is written and we ignore it. The conservative movement really struggles with Jewish law and how we can change Jewish law to to be accommodated in the society. So it's not surprising to see some of these great thinkers come out of the conservative movement, because the tradition there really is a struggle to adapt Jewish law.
Well, Rabbi, where do the 10 Commandments come in?
The 10 Commandments are in the Bible.
Oh.
Say it again? I didn't hear you.
They're in the Bible.
Oh, okay.
Jewish law comes out of the Bible. So observing the Sabbath is mentioned in the 10 Commandments, right?
Okay.
But now, what am I supposed to do? And what am I not supposed to do to observe the Sabbath? That's not written in the 10 Commandments. You're punishable by death if you violate that commandment. But so that should make you a little nervous about the fact that the details of what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do are not written there. So you go to other sacred texts, the Mishnah and the Talmud. So, for example, and we're going to see this example in the conservative movement, for a variety of reasons, you can't get in your car and drive on the Sabbath. For one thing, you're making a fire once you turn on the engine in your car, even if it's all electric, you're making a fire. For another thing, you're not supposed to go outside the boundaries of an enclosed area more than 4 amot.
It's only if you're carrying something.
Yes, you're not allowed to carry anything. But if you're in the car, you're carrying stuff, namely the car. But the conservative movement, as I think is mentioned in this article, will say you can drive on the Sabbath to go to synagogue. So they are really going to struggle with these issues. In the Reform movement, nobody's struggling with those kinds of issues.
The conservative movement, I understand, didn't do this ability to drive to Shabbat services until after World War II, when the communities were started being scattered around.
Yes.
So it wasn't originally the arrangement.
Oh, yeah. But that's the watchword of struggling. Namely, when the world changes, you change Jewish law. In the Orthodox movement, you don't change Jewish law. You have to adapt Jewish law to new situations. But so what the Orthodox world is going to say, we can artificially create eruvs to say you're not really leaving the boundaries of your area. But it still means that you have to live basically within walking distance of your synagogue. So that's why you have, very Jewish neighborhoods, because by definition in the Orthodox world, you can't drive to synagogue. You have to walk, which means you need to live within walking distance. Okay, let's continue.
And if you're not, then there are some Orthodox rabbis that have said as long as you're just going to synagogue and back home, they could accept that if you're going to be
I've
with.
never heard of an Orthodox rabbi saying that. I think that's the position of the conservative movement. I personally have never heard of an Orthodox rabbi saying that. There are plenty of Orthodox Jews that do that, and the rabbis know that, but I think they choose to kind of close their eyes to it rather than officially saying it's okay.
I see. Okay.
I
All right.
don't know if this is true. I read there's somewhere where a lot of the people do it, but they park in the parking lot of a conservative reform synagogue, so that the Orthodox synagogue parking lot will stay empty on Shabbos.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, even and so yes. So in an Orthodox synagogue, no one's driving and parking in the parking lot. People are parking on the street and so on, a far enough distance so it'll look like they're walking. So, okay, let's continue.
The movement has been, this is balancing Jewish law and modernity. The movement has been defined by its official commitment to Jewish law, halakha, even as it has staked out positions that entail substantial departures from what was long considered normative Jewish practice. In 1983, the movement began ordaining women rabbis, which prompted some JTS faculty to quit the school in protest. In 1998, the movement's updated prayer book, Sim Shalom, contained the alternative Amida text that included the names of the matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, alongside the names of the patriarchs. Some of the God language in the book replaced gendered language such as king and father with more gender neutral terms like sovereign and guardian.
And
One
it's one of the reasons I always comment that, the Bible doesn't change, the Talmud doesn't change, but prayer books change. And this is true even in the Orthodox world. The different communities have different prayer books. In the Orthodox prayer books, there will be prayers for the state of Israel, which by definition, couldn't have existed over 75 years ago. So prayer books change all the time. And this is, again, the conservative movement struggling with these issues.
Yeah.
And by the way, of course, the Reform movement did these things a few years before the conservative movement.
And then depending on what text and where you are, I keep seeing, like, instead of hearing the Lord is your shepherd or my shepherd, it would be my God is my shepherd. And yeah, you're right. Well,
yes. So the English translations are far more fluid than Hebrew. I mean, we have, King James and we have Old English and so on. So that's one issue. And that tends to upset most people because what we understand is the English, but what's happening here in the Amidah is they're actually adding in the Hebrew. The original Hebrew is Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov, and then they're going to add Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah. So they're changing the Hebrew as well as adjusting the English. When we do gender neutral, for the most part, the Hebrew remains intact, very gendered, but the English translation changes. The Reconstructionist movement will actually change some of the Hebrew to be gender neutral, which is actually quite difficult in Hebrew to do, but possible.
Oh.
Why is it though that it's all the patriarchs and then all the matriarchs? If you're really trying to be neutral, that shouldn't you be like mixing them randomly or going chronologically or something?
Well, that I'm sure they consider that option. And the issue is you're going to make one change, and that's what's going to be printed in the prayer book. One of the interesting ones is in the older Reform prayer books, it was for the women, it was Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Leah, Elohei Rachel. And then in the latest one, Rachel gets mentioned before Leah. And that's because there's only a few places in the Talmud where the matriarchs are listed, and they're always listed in that order. And also, the word after Leah is Ha'el, Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora, and Leah spelled backwards is Ha'el. Remember, you heard it here.
That actually is very good, because the order of the matriarchs, most times I've asked that question, nobody had even an idea, and you've helped me.
That's actually, I not only have an idea, I have two ideas. But yeah, that was actually controversial. You can imagine. I mean, I know many of the rabbis that put these prayer books together, and they have committees, and they agonize over everything. So one option, I'm sure, Stephen, was, should we say Elohei Avraham, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei? That would be a perfectly reasonable.
More radical would be to point out
husband and wife together.
What we're doing is these are the spouses of the patriarchs. It's not a female mother-daughter line. We're not putting we're putting in Jacob's mother, but we're not putting in the parents
but it's
of Rachel, Leah, and Rebecca.
In Jewish tradition, the focus is on the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and they are honored in various places.
Yes.
So anyway, let's continue. One of the movement's most.
Yeah, we don't even know who some of those parents are.
There's probably good reasons we do not put Lavan into the Amida.
Okay. All right, thanks.
We don't mention Abraham's father either. So
right? But that's in a generation where we don't mention anybody. My point was, for those generations where we do mention people, we mention the.
We don't always mention both father and mother.
We mention Abraham and Sarah. We don't mention the parents of Rebecca,
right,
or of Rachel, or of Leah.
Right.
Correct.
Yes. Okay, let's continue.
We mentioned only the
One
parents
of the movement's most significant, some would say fateful innovations was the 1950 ruling permitting worshipers to drive to synagogue, but nowhere else on Shabbat, amid rapid suburbanization of post-war America. This change enabled many to attend synagogue who would otherwise be unable to get there on the Jewish Sabbath, when driving is traditionally prohibited. However, some critics would later point to this shift as undermining the movement's stated commitment to Jewish law. That's interesting, because even Dennis Prager drives to synagogue.
Yeah, but then Dennis Prager has long been a member of a Reform congregation.
Yeah, but he left that and he's with a conservative.
Okay, so in the conservative,
he's following 20 years.
So he's following the conservative rules.
Yeah.
Correction, something you said earlier, that you would have to live within walking distance. There's a question as to whether riding a bicycle inside an Eruv is permissible.
I've never heard that question raised.
Well, anyway, without an Eruv, it's definitely a no-no because it's carrying. But there's not uniform agreement on whether you can ride a bicycle within an
Eruv.
Eruv.
Yeah, so I'm not a halachic scholar, but I don't know why there would be any objection.
Well, if you shouldn't
if you're in the Eruv. But anyway, there might be a technical objection.
Considered work.
I think what the decision was is you can do it for the sake of a mitzvah, including to attend services, but not just for. I doubt not as a general rule. It's sort of like driving conservative, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a concept in Orthodoxy called marat ayin, which means marat is from the same root as hara, or maror, sorry, not hara, maror, bitter. It's like the bitterness of the eye. So there are some things in, I would say this is more minchag rather than Jewish law, that are discouraged in the world of Orthodoxy because it may look like you're violating Jewish law. And the best example I can think of is Bakos. Bakos may be technically kosher because they're made from soybeans. I don't know if they're actually certified kosher. I should check because I love Bakos. But they're definitely not made from pork products. But eating them might confuse other people to think that you're eating bacon. So that kind of thing is discouraged. And maybe it's just sort of offensive to the eye to have people ride bicycles. I actually don't know in the Orthodox community whether
there's a lot of bicycle riding in Israel on Yom Kippur.
Yeah, so if it's the rules for Yom Kippur and riding would be identical to Shabbat for purposes for riding. Okay, I don't think
the difference is that lots of people do drive on Shabbat in Israel, but on Yom Kippur, almost nobody drives in Israel. So the roads are complete. So people who want to buy can do so without having to deal with car traffic.
Yeah. So the question is, are the people riding bicycles Orthodox, or are they chilonim? I can't remember the English word. God, I must be
secular.
Yes.
Where are they going on their bikes?
They're just riding down the freeways because it's cool. Because there's not a car on the freeway. Because on Yom Kippur, everybody, Orthodox, non-Orthodox, everyone's in synagogue, and except for the people that don't go to synagogue and they're out riding their bikes. Jane.
Hi. Did the part that you were reading about, I guess it was a paragraph before when it said about the suburbanization and people being able to drive to synagogue, didn't also COVID change some of the stuff?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yes. So you're not allowed to use electricity on Shabbat. So in the Orthodox world, no change. You there were minions formed where people were standing 6 feet apart. You'd get together in the backyard of someone's house and you'd have your Shabbat minyan. And assuming you were obeying rules about COVID, and as you probably know, a lot in Israel of the ultra-Orthodox world just decided that God will protect us and we don't have to worry about COVID. And a lot of them got sick and a lot of them died. But there were examples of people who would have services outdoors, maintaining some distance, trying to be protective. That's in the Orthodox world. In the conservative world, there was, and I'm sure it rose to the standard of an official ruling, that the value of gathering for Shabbat safely was more important than the violation of using electricity. And so they did issue a rule for purposes of only during this medical emergency that you could have Shabbat minyanim on Zoom. So that's an example. That's actually a very good example of what we're talking about here, and it never got into the Orthodox world, to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for raising it. Okay, we're moving toward the end of this article, and I guess we'll do Orthodoxy next time. Responding. Jerry, you want to continue?
Responding to the LGBTQ Jews and intermarriage in 2006, the movement's unity was further strained by the effort to address the status of gays and lesbians. The movement's Jewish Law Authority, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, eventually adopted 3 papers on the subject: 2 upholding the traditional ban on homosexuality and 1 permitting commitment ceremonies and the ordination of gay rabbis. In the wake of the vote, 4 members of the committee resigned to protest over the liberal paper. But in the months that followed the movements to American rabbinical seminaries, JTS and the Ziegler the School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles modified their admission standards to permit openly gay students.
Yeah, so this was a big issue in the conservative movement. And it also kind of reflects this idea that they didn't actually decide as a movement. They issued 3 opinions, and then, I mean, I don't know the details, but I guess just left to the faculty, whoever makes decisions, policy decisions for those schools, whether or not to admit openly gay and lesbian rabbis. And
that
both
happened at our schools too. At Thousand Oaks High School, there was objection to the vote of the administration to ban, I don't know how they could ban it, but for, couples of the same gender to dance together. But that's changed. And I noticed a drastic change by the year 2000 where students would be openly gay and lesbian holding hands.
Yeah,
Just
I mean, I don't want to get into that. Culture has changed. The question is, can Jewish law change? And in the reform movement, since there's not a lot of focus on ritual Jewish law anyway, this was not a hugely controversial thing in the reform movement. In the conservative movement, it was very controversial. And I personally know rabbis who are gay who would have gone to the conservative movement, to JTS or to the Ziegler School, but for this ban on homosexuality, and went to HUC instead, and
Right.
And now would go and would be welcomed by the conservative seminaries.
Yeah, Rabbi Gore.
Well, he is a Reform rabbi. I don't know that Rabbi Gore would have ever given a thought to going to a conservative seminary, but he is a openly gay
Yes, very.
Reform rabbi. Very, I don't know if there are degrees, except that he's married to a gay cantor. Right.
Who has a magnificent voice.
Right. Okay.
Okay, the road ahead.
No, another issue.
Sorry. Another issue with which conservative Judaism was struggled in is intermarriage. The movement was for decades staunchly against Jews marrying non-Jews, and its rabbis are still forbidden from officiating at interfaith marriages, just like you said. In addition, it does not recognize patrilineal descent, the reform movement's decision to recognize as Jews the Jewish raised children of Jewish fathers and Gentile mothers. However, in recent years, growing number of voices within the movement have pressed to soften the approach, and many conservative rabbis emphasize that while they do not officiate at interfaith weddings, they welcome interfaith couples and interfaith families into their congregation. One thing that I noticed that Rabbi Diamond does during a high holiday service, he'll call up interfaith couples for a special blessing because they are supporting the Jewish family, the children, and are considered, what do we say?
Does he call them up as couples or just the non-Jewish?
Couples.
Yeah. Janet Martyr, who Alan and I know very well.
I know Janet very well,
instituted a blessing for the non-Jews who are supporting the congregation.
Yeah, she did it in the temple here in Palo Alto for 20 years.
Yeah.
Oh, she's in Palo Alto. Oh my gosh.
She's retired, I think.
With 40 years ago, I was on a committee with her. Wow.
The other thing I want to mention, and most people don't know this, but it's highly controversial I would say, in the world of HUC, in the reform movement, and that is the Hebrew Union College will not ordain a rabbi, I think, or a cantor, and maybe not even an educator, who is married to a non-Jew.
That's right. It's always under review.
And it's always a subject of lots and lots of controversy. And
I know still the daughter of a family here. She went to rabbinic school in the Reconstructive movement specifically for that reason, because she was, engaged to a non-Jewish man, and they broke up, and so then she transferred to HUC.
Yeah, and as you're suggesting, the Reconstructionist movement does allow it. But I remember in my first year or second year, that was a huge issue for some of the rabbinic students who were in a relationship with a non-Jew, and if that the rule was then, and I don't ever remember it being a written rule. I think it's just you're supposed to know this, but the rule was that at the time of your ordination, you could not be married to a non-Jew. I think plenty of Reform rabbis, once they're ordained, get married to non-Jews, and there's no kind of retroactive cancellation of your smicha. But it is an interesting.
Well, could you just get divorced 5 minutes before the ordination and then remarried 5 minutes after it to the same person?
I wouldn't suggest it.
There's a stress on ethics in this organization.
Yes. There is a phrase I used to learn when I was in the tax shelter business, Stephen, and it was, I couldn't be more sincere if I meant it. But I don't think that particular idea is welcomed into the rabbinate. Let's see. I think we can finish up the article, The Road Ahead.
Okay. In the 21st century, the movement's long-term viability has continued to be drawn into question. The percentage of Jewish households that identified as conservative dropped by 10 points from 43 to 33%. Between 1990 and 2000, according to the surveys of the American Jewish population conducted in those years. By 2013, a Pew survey found only 18% of American Jews identified as conservative, roughly half the number that call themselves Reform. The movement's synagogue umbrella group, the United Synagogue for Conservative Judaism, also experienced a significant drop off in affiliated congregations. The decline is attributed to various factors, chief among them intermarriage. A majority of intermarried Jews who were raised conservative no longer identify as such as adults, according to sociologist Stephen M. Cohen. At least some of those Jews have gravitated toward the Reform movement, which has traditionally been more welcoming of intermarried couples. Others have pointed to movement's liberalization with years, which has turned off more traditionally minded Jews, as well as to the rise of independent minions, which have attracted many graduates of conservative day schools and summer camps. Still others have figured geographic mobility historically had a strong presence.
Have fingered geographic mobility as the culprit.
My eyes are not.
I'll finish reading. And then I'll call on Bryce. The relocation of American Jews from areas where the conservative movement historically had a strong presence, the Northeast and the Midwest, to areas where Reform congregations predominated, the South and the West. But according to Cohen, there remain some encouraging signs of life for the movement in recent studies, showing that that among those who do identify as conservative, metrics of Jewish engagement remain strong. What conservative institutions like camps and day schools have been doing is working to build a core group with a relatively high level of Jewish observance, engagement, and literacy, Cohen wrote in 2015. If they keep doing so, the evidence suggests that while the overall number of conservative Jews may still decline, this dedicated core will continue to sustain what was once America's largest Jewish denomination. I'll call on Bryce. Bryce, are you asking about anything in the text or?
Yes,
absolutely. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
So it has to do with the previous paragraph having to do with the decline. It strikes me that if the conservative movement officially discourages participation by interfaith couples, it shouldn't be, and it strongly discourages it, which would tend to drive, I think, many people away.
So just to be clear, the article didn't say that. What the article said was in recent years, they are more welcoming of interfaith couples, but the rabbis won't officiate at interfaith marriages. So
I know, but that's still discouraging. In other words, what I'm saying is that certainly is a message saying you're really not welcome here.
That is absolutely true.
Okay. So the point being is, and then I also see demographically that if you have Jews that want to be more dedicated, then they're going to gravitate toward modern Orthodoxy.
Yes.
Okay. So you've got the conservative movement is just like
yes, it's leaking out both sides. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think some of you who are familiar with conservative congregations, I think one in Denver and some in the East, have said that the conservative congregations that are surviving have gotten more observant and closer to Orthodox, whereas on the West Coast, they have gotten more and more close to a Reform. So the question, which I think implicitly you're raising, Bryce, I'm going to stop sharing, is what's the reason for existence of the conservative movement? And it's clearly in trouble, and it's just not clear how well it will do in the future. And the other thing, which I often don't think of, and I'm glad this article reminded me of it, is there's also a lot of what we would call independent minions that are arising, and these are groups, and we see it in. I mean, I've served some of those that were not affiliated. Yeah, I think the congregation congregation in Ojai is not technically affiliated with any of the movements. There's several in the Valley, and I think even in Thousand Oaks, there's one, I can't remember the name of it, which is not affiliated with any of the movements. They tend to lean to what I would call a Reform approach, often using Reform prayer books and sort of Reform lack of strict observance of Jewish law. But yeah, I think the conservative movement is having trouble finding a reason for continued existence, and is losing members for exactly the reason I think that Bryce mentioned. And by the way, that's the reason why I officiate at interfaith marriages, because I want to signal a welcoming message to interfaith couples. Because maybe 50 years ago, a couple would decide not to get married because they were interfaith and there was no rabbi who was willing to marry them. Today, if a couple is getting married, they're going to get married whether they can find a rabbi or not. And the question is whether they feel welcomed by Judaism or whether they feel shunned and embarrassed by Judaism.
What is the reason for the independence of the independent minions?
Oh, one of the reasons is they don't have to pay dues, which are quite substantial. To the dues that Temple Adat Elohim pays to the Reform movement is quite substantial, and it actually supports, the college, and it supports the publication of prayer books and other things. So in a way, a independent minion that's using the reform movement for a lot of things is kind of like someone who attends reform services but never joins and is not, helping to pay the rent, helping to pay the rabbi and the cantor and so on. But that is a major reason. The other thing is I think a lot of congregations don't like to feel bound to any particular, movement. They want to feel more.
I think that's important. I'll throw in because in the synagogue near me here, where their actually webpage talks about being a blend of conservative and reform. There may be some financial background to this, but I think it has to do with the community. When they form this synagogue to make it work, they end up with these tensions that the hybrid's not the right word, because this has been around for 50 years, that synagogues are a mix of conservative and reform. In fact, there was a model. I know a synagogue in San Francisco where you could be the synagogue could be a member of both the United Synagogue and the UAC, and they would pay half the amount of dues calculated, and they would really be a member of both movements.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's pretty much waned away, in my opinion, much of my knowledge. But that was a phase of the 60s and 70s, I think.
Rabbi,
Maxine, go ahead. Yes.
Where do the movements stand politically in regards to our country?
So I would say,
are they concerned?
Hold on. I would say, broadly speaking, reform movements tend to be more on the liberal side, and broadly speaking, Orthodox congregations tend to be more conservative. But it's very much a function of individuals, and as you may or may not know, that a 501c3, a tax-exempt organization, is prohibited from endorsing specific candidates. It can take positions on issues, but it can't endorse a candidate. Jerry.
Yeah, I am one of these very strange people that belong to an Orthodox, a conservative, and a Reform temple.
Mm-hmm.
I support them all.
Mm-hmm.
I love each one for what they are and what they do.
Mm-hmm.
The minion that I go to, you might call conservative, but it leans Orthodox in that the matriarchs are not mentioned in the Amida. And I think that is probably because of Dennis Prager himself, growing up in a yeshiva, his views were all.
Does he lead the prayers?
No, he does the drash.
Okay.
He does.
So in the conservative prayer book, there is an option to either put in the matriarchs or not. So that's up to the service.
There's no option. It's just not in there. And they have their own book.
Oh, okay. So in the standard conservative prayer book, there is an option.
Yeah.
Okay.
But not in this. But
okay.
Yeah. And then, of course, absolutely not in, when I go to.
Is there mixed seating in the conservative leaning?
Is what?
Men and women sit together in that congregation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So that would not. Yeah.
I would, very often I will see that, there are some men that group together, and you could almost hear that they will daven over some of the women's voices, but there's no rejection.
And there's definitely not a mechitza between them.
Right. And everybody gives what they feel they can. They have between 200 and 300 that come every Shabbat, and another 200 that are online, Zooming, because
And are they affiliated with any of the movements?
No.
Okay. So that's another independent congregation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And it came out of, Stephen S. Weiss. And I know that because
there used to be something called the Library Minion. It sounds
right,
like the evolution
my
of that.
My daughter-in-law led that. That's 25 years ago, and that's when I started hearing Dennis coming and doing the drash.
Right.
I don't know what schism took place exactly, but there was kind of like
it was an independent minyan. I know that many of the professors at HUC who were more observant than many other reform the colleagues would attend that minyan. It was a great minyan because it was attended by a lot of really major leaders and thinkers in the Jewish world.
There are great scholars. There really are.
Beth Am.
And I love the services that they lead. They're absolutely amazing.
Beth Am is a conservative synagogue affiliate.
Right. It's not Stephen S. Wise that Jerry just mentioned.
No, they started there. They branched off.
Yeah. So again, I know Prager started at Stephen S. Wise. I don't know where the library minyan started, but
just by the way, this is kind of interesting that I talked to one of my colleagues this week, a young woman who works for Jewish Federation here in LA, and she is getting married in the first lesbian wedding at Beth Am in a couple of months.
Oh my gosh.
That's it. I'm actually surprised that it's the first, because I think the conservative movement is pretty flexible, particularly, I mean, I would think historically, Jewishly, for lesbian relationships than male homosexual relationships, because the Talmud and the rabbinic literature is essentially silent on lesbian relationships. It's probable that biblically and rabbinically, they did not consider a lesbian relationship to be a sexual relationship. For that world, sex was penetration. A penis is going into something somewhere, and that's what a sexual relationship is. So for male homosexuality, there was an issue. And even in the conservative movement, I'm not certain about this, but I think technically they still prohibit anal intercourse, even though they will officiate in a marriage between two men. That would still be a practice, that would be prohibited in the conservative movement. I don't know that there's any issues in the lesbian world. I'm actually a little surprised that it's taken them that long. But
well, who knows?
It's up to the rabbis,
right? And they may have had many, male gay men. But she's getting married there, and I was surprised to hear that. Because I'm probably your only regular who's an LA person, that here in LA, say I live in the Valley, the biggest and most influential synagogue here is conservative, not reform.
Yeah, Valley Beth Shalom.
Yes.
But that's my congregation.
Yes.
And by far. And also in the city, while they do have Wilshire Boulevard, and that's extremely important, and Stephen S. Wise, which is half and half Valley City, but Sinai Temple.
Yes.
And what I was just thinking about is the demography of the Farsi community, that some of my friends think that BBS is a third already. I don't think they're right, and Sinai for sure.
That it's very heavily Farsi. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't know what they mean by heavily, but I think it has tended to keep us more traditional. And anyway, because there's a lot of different things. I think the reform movement is stronger when you get outside of a big metropolitan area like LA.
Yeah, the issue is, if you're in a very heavily Jewish area, you're going to have people who are leaning toward more observance. So I'm actually clicking all the links that Cheryl is posting in chat while we're speaking. Thank you, Cheryl. So if you're in a heavily Jewish area, you're going to have a significant population who leans more towards observance. So you're going to have healthy, influential, vigorous conservative synagogues. In Valley Beth Shalom, and the rabbi there, the last two rabbis, are tremendous scholars and are very influential, and also the big conservative synagogue Temple Sinai, David Wolpe, who just retired, very, very influential. So yeah, but if you if you head out to Camarillo and Ventura, yeah, there's well, in Camarillo there are no conservative synagogues. In Ventura there is one, and it's a very small, doesn't have regular services, very aging population, not what I would call vigorous. There's a healthy synagogue in Thousand Oaks, a conservative synagogue.
You know what I think is dying here in LA is modern Orthodoxy.
Yeah,
there's only one shul left.
Mm-hmm.
I did a consulting job with them this past year.
Yeah,
and
I don't track that, but
right, they're gone. I mean, there's a lot of these congregations either that existed before, either they went more from or they went out of business. And this is the only.
Now, there are healthy Sephardic synagogues in the LA area, and even a Moroccan synagogue.
A couple.
Yeah, there are a couple, and technically they're Orthodox, but in terms of practice, they're much more relaxed than the world of Orthodoxy. When we discuss Orthodoxy, which we'll do in like 3 more weeks, I'm going to be 2 weeks for winter holidays, and then the following week in January I'm at a rabbinic conference. But we'll discuss Orthodoxy, and we can discuss that phenomenon. But it is a very interesting phenomenon. So thank you all.
Wednesday,
there's a third article that Cheryl just posted. Thank you, Cheryl.
The first Wednesday in January, you're back or you're not?
I knew somebody would ask me that. You think I actually remember this? The next class of this group will be on the 17th.
Oh, the 17th. Okay.
So that's
the reason they selected Cincinnati because the name begins sin.
I can confidently say no.
And there's a reform seminary that's closing.
Yeah, well, one of the branches of HUC is closing, and it's rabbinical school in Cincinnati, and that's very controversial in the reform movement among reform rabbis who went to Cincinnati.
If you want a serious answer to the Cincinnati,
no, it was the Wild West.
Well, that was Isaac Meyer Wise's idea, was when he needed a job that he would go as far west as he thought Jews were, and that's how he identified Cincinnati to start UAC and Hebrew Union College.
Right.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
And any other holidays that people celebrate?
Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Boxing Day.
God willing, we'll have an end to the war.
Yeah, it's
your mouth to God's ear.
Please.
Yeah, I'm actually I'm attending I think a very small luncheon with the Israel Consul General tomorrow, and I'm very anxious to hear what he has to say. I'll mention 2 things I learned actually at a Federation event a week ago, which I think are I'll mention 3 things which I think are very important and, for me at least, profound. This is quoting, I think his name is Michael Berenbaum, a Holocaust scholar. He said, people are calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. There was a ceasefire in Gaza on October 6th. That was broken on October 7th. Second, he pointed out that if the Arab states surrounding Israel had accepted the United Nations partition in 1947, the Palestinian state, whatever it would be called, would be celebrating 75 years of existence instead of just struggling. And then the other point, which I think is more of a political point, which I learned, I think some of you may be attended the series that Temple Bet Torah hosted, and the Israeli who was speaking there pointed out something which I think is important politically to keep in mind, and that is there doesn't seem to be any end game in Israel where the Netanyahu government is saying realistically, if we can get to here, 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 and here, we will back off. Because if he even shows a hint of compromise against total obliteration and destruction of Hamas, he will be out of a job, within weeks, because he will
be out of the job. There's no scenario where he won't be out of the job.
He's going to be out of a job anyway.
Well, right now, no. Well, the interesting thing about his situation now, as long as the war continues, he's got a job.
Yeah, what you're making is a case for endless war.
Yeah. So, and this may tell you something of what I think about Netanyahu. But the interesting thing is, it's very hard for him to adopt. It's almost impossible for him to adopt any compromising situation, and that's one of the many complexities of that world. And I wish I could leave you on a happier note than that. But what I'm hearing is that the war will probably enter a less drastic phase, which will be hopefully less punishing to human suffering. So with that hope, I will wish you a happy and healthy new year, and see you in a few weeks, except for those of you who indulge with us in Torah study. And I think that's going on regularly as scheduled.
Okay.
So
are you participating?
Okay. Happy New Year, everyone.
Yeah, Happy New Year. I'll be there on Saturday. Yes.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Stay well.
Take care.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Rabbi.